how do we prep for panel-to-panel blocking? I've had a few people ask me the prep process after the video with the Chevelle doing some panel-to-panel. So I'll just give you guys a quick rundown of how we prep these panels for filler work. So basically what we do, we'll start with running a block over these, and this deck lid is a little beat up, but you'll find your lows. You just kind of get a map. And then something like this, I'm going to skim this whole thing. I'm not going to sit here and try to fill every little imperfection individually. We're doing panel to panel anyway, so we're going to glaze pretty much the entire car. So when we are thinking about how to prep this, that's what we're going to do. Basically, give it a block. We're going to get our map, just so we know in our head kind of how bad it is and what to expect. So you can see our map. This side really probably isn't as bad as this side. There's, as far as dents, there's a few dents. But when we start doing panel to panel, I'm running this block up onto the next panel like this. And even though this all says it's low, pretty much this entire corner, it is so minutely low to the next panel. That's why we do panel to panel. You're basically fitting the car together seamlessly, as if gaps don't exist from one panel to the next. Just like you carve this all out of a solid piece and cut lines in it. That's the goal with panel to panel. So since I know that I'm gonna glaze and skim this whole area anyway, what we generally do here is we just go at it with the DA. We want to scuff all this epoxy up. This is CRE 921. We want no shine left in this before we go putting any sort of filler or glaze over this. That's where you're going to get your adhesion. Even people that say your epoxy recoat window is 7 days. That doesn't mean that you can come in and put filler on it after 3 days without sanding it. If that epoxy is cured, sand it. Even if anything over 12 hours, and you shouldn't be putting filler over epoxy that's only 12 hours old either. Top coat in the TDS sheets for the epoxies, that doesn't necessarily mean filler. Some of the TDSs have a specific phrase in there about if you're putting filler or spray poly over that epoxy to give it at least 48 hours. Because that filler and those spray polys, which is basically sprayable filler, that's going to dry really fast, and it's going to trap all those solvents that are still in that epoxy. It's going to trap them down. This car has probably been sitting almost 2 weeks since we epoxied it. So when we go to start our panel to panel prep for filler work, I'm just going to buzz this all down with 80. So here I have 350 grams of filler with 7 grams of hardener. That's 50 to 1, 2%. That's ideal mix ratio for filler. A lot of guys just run a ribbon over it. Everything else in the process of all this has a mix ratio. I don't know why people think filler doesn't have a mix ratio. 50 to 1, 2%. Some fillers you can go down to, a 0.5% and this and that and get more work time. I think when you do 50 to 1 on every step, you're creating more uniform surface than when you have different mix ratios. If I have different mix ratios of filler, some is harder than others, some is softer than others, it's going to sand different, it's going to shrink differently, it's going to expand differently in high temperatures outside in the sun. Just 50 to 1. So when I go to spread all this, I'm going to try to do this half in one spread. And just like before, I'm going to start with a tight coat. I'm just going to kind of put it on there, push it all down. Not really worried about building at this point. I'm worried about adhesion to this panel. So I've got 350 grams here, and I think that'll probably be enough to skim this. And you can see how hard I'm pushing when I'm doing this. I'm actually moving this panel on a few spots because I'm trying to get it worked down into those 80 grit scratches as well as possible. And this will help a ton with pinholes also. As you're squeegeeing this out nice and tight, you're also squeegeeing the air out. So now that I've got it established, now I'm going to come in and start working at panel to panel. I'm going to put it on, same thing, right up on that edge where I don't have it really pushed. I'm going to push it right up against my tape. Build on that panel to panel. Then, kind of to end this, I'm going to take the little bit extra that I have and I'm just going to kind of spread it somewhat evenly. I'm not really worried about lines or anything at this point. Then I can take one of these big spreaders and I'll follow this whole area of panel to panel. You're not going to get this on the first try either. This is there's a certain finesse in using a big spreader and keeping a wet edge on that spreader and keeping a build for it to roll off of. So now I've got it somewhat planed out. And I'll take a little bit smaller, more flexible spreader sometimes and work my edges. And sometimes I'll even come back in and touch a few things up with a smaller spreader. We don't just use one spreader. We use a variety of spreaders. Now that I've got this planed out, you can see it's kind of got a texture to it. Now if I just float this across very lightly, I can knock a lot of that texture right out of it. It's just like when you sand anything. You start aggressive and you go finer. Finer, finer, finer. Pretty satisfied with that. When I get this going on, if I've got filler hanging over an edge like that, just cut you a nice line, roll that in. That's going to be a lot easier to feather in than a big fat edge. And then while this is wet, pull our tape. And I did this, I put this line here because this has a fading line. It's a distinct body line back here and it disappears as it goes forward. So I don't want to lose that line.